Welcome back, Honors. All right, so let's get into this atrociously long flip, I know. All right, so we're covering multiple subjects in this flip. We're going to be talking about the Crusades, and then we'll also be talking about a very special document that is going to be very important to your basic understanding of rights and how they work in Western civilizations for the rest of your entire existence. All right, but let's go ahead and get into it. So we spent class talking about the Nation of Islam, right? We talked about Islam, talked about their structure, the prophet, their name for God, their holy book, the 5 pillars, and we basically just talked about how they were birthed during the 610s AD, right? So around 610 AD, you could say that the Nation of Islam, or the religion of Islam, officially began, right? Well, rolling forward several hundred years, during that time period, the Nation of Islam was growing very, very large. We talked about that at the very beginning of the Middle Ages unit. We discussed how the certain groups and kingdoms of Islamic people were growing very large. We even got into it for a minute when we were talking about Charles the Hammer Martel, right? How he smashed at the Battle of Tours all the way back down into Spain, the Muslim kingdoms underneath their new caliphate. Actually, if you wanted to know, they were known as the Umayyad Caliphate, right? Now, but interestingly enough, there is going to be some contentious moments and several periods of war during this time period between Christian armies and Islamic forces, okay? So you're going to see these large bouts known as the Crusades, right? So the Crusades are a set of religious wars in order to regain what is referred to in the modern era by Christians, Jewish people, and Islamic people as the Holy Land or the Holy City, which is the land of Jerusalem, right? So this is going to occur, and I don't know how many times I have to say this, during the High Middle Ages and during the Late Middle Ages, right? It actually spans both of them. So it began in the High Middle Ages, and there were multiple different crusades. Before we even get started, you can go ahead and jot that down. But there were multiple crusades. Some people believe there were over 9, okay? So depending on who you ask or what historian you ask, because there's one that was probably fictional, the Children's Crusade, and then all this other stuff. But it occurred during the High Middle Ages and the Late Middle Ages, right? So as you can see, this is the holy city of Jerusalem, right? So this holy city of Jerusalem is very, very important because it contains holy sites for all 3 major Abrahamic faiths, right? We talked about in class how Islam is the 3rd Abrahamic faith, right? We talked about how it is the 3rd Abrahamic faith and a series of others: Judaism, Christianity, Islam, right? All relating back, of course, to the founding father of Abraham. Now, interestingly enough, though, in Jerusalem, where Abraham is actually believed to have done much of his work as the Judaic leader, there is going to be founded this holy city of Jerusalem. And in the modern era, this city contains holy sites to every single major Abrahamic faith, right? You've got 2 of them that you can see right here. But just to give you a heads up, Jesus Christ did a lot of his teaching and his preaching in the city of Jerusalem. He also was baptized in the city of Jerusalem in a font that you yourself could go and be baptized at today. So that is your major Christian sites, right? This right here is the Wailing Wall, is what it's known as. It is the border wall of a very large temple that was destroyed by the Romans during the Empire period. And this is the only remaining wall that actually still stands from that temple that was destroyed. Now, interestingly enough, this is a major holy site for Jewish people. As you can see, there's a large crowd right here. And they actually go there on certain pilgrimages. They get their arms bound and roped, and they actually say a certain prayer, and they go up and they write their prayer down on a small piece of paper, and they insert it into the cracks of the Wailing Wall, believing that it's a way to communicate better with God. And this right here, of course, 2 Islamic holy sites. This is a minaret temple where they do their call to prayer. And this right here is the Dome of the Rock, right? The Dome of the Rock is an Islamic holy site where it is believed that Muhammad ascended into heaven, right? So as you can see, we've got a ton of very holy sites in Jerusalem. So when you refer to the Holy Land or the Holy City, we are always referring to Jerusalem, right? Now, what's going to occur in the late 10s AD, so in the late 1090s, okay, Muslims are going to take control of not the Holy Land itself, not Jerusalem itself, but of areas outside of Jerusalem. And they're also going to begin to threaten the Byzantine, right? Because Turks are going to take control of Persia and other areas, which is going to lead to the Byzantine emperor calling for aid, right? And I believe it was a woman, actually, at the time. I think her name was Irene. So now I'll double check on that. But actually, the Byzantine emperor called for assistance during the Crusades, right? Called for assistance. It was like, we need your help to prevent the Muslim kingdoms from not only taking over Constantinople, but also from taking over the holy state of Jerusalem, right? We need your assistance here. Please come and aid us to prevent the falling of our city and also the falling of our holy land of Jerusalem, right? Well, the Muslims did take control of Jerusalem for a certain amount of time, and as you can see, there was a huge amount of forces right here in this purple. That is actually Muslim forces that are going to be moving in, and Constantinople is under extreme threat, right? So what's going to occur is the Pope at the time, Pope Urban II, is going to call a very famous council. And that council is known as the Council of Clermont. And at the Council of Clermont in 1095 AD, the Pope is going to call for a great pilgrimage to go out and retake the Holy Land, right? And Urban II called for all Christian warriors to go out and fight against the Turks, who these Turks happened to be of the Nation of Islam at the time. So this right here is the bedrock beginning of the Crusades, when Pope Urban II calls for all Christian warriors to go. And he had a very, very large crowd in Rome. He actually gave a very fiery speech discussing how all Christian warriors will be forgiven of their sins and they will be considered clean of soul as they ascend into heaven if they die defending the faith, right? And so Urban VIII inspired and got all these Christian warriors all juiced up. And word began to travel pretty quickly that this idea of a crusade was going to occur, right? And so they set out for Constantinople. Now, some of y'all are like, well, who set out for Constantinople? Well, this is the 1090s AD, so you're usually referring to feudal armies setting out towards Constantinople. The way feudal armies are assembled is typically what occurs is a king calls to the nobles and says, assemble your vassals. They assemble all of their knights and trained military professionals, or what they believe are trained military professionals, and they create armies. They report to their king. The king then reports back to the Pope, and then they go out all together, right? Now, in your mind, or mainly because of sports and the fact that this is Brother Martin's mascot, some of you are probably like, all right, which is fine, whatever, do your thing, I don't care. So they are known as the Crusaders, right? And Crusaders are often depicted as knights, right? Knights fully clad in armor, carrying a sword, a large shield, right? And going into battle triumphantly on a steed to proclaim the Holy Land for themselves and for Christ, right? Well, that was only a small percentage of Crusaders, right? Most Crusaders were just poor people, right? So during the First Crusade, most of the Crusaders were actually unarmored, untrained, unprofessional knights, and then also 50% of them were just a bunch of really poor people that happened to have a sword, right? So, and a lot of it, you have to understand, is there were actually not one, but two crusades going on at the same time during the first one, all right? Some of you are like, Mr. Terry, I don't understand. All right, well, look. So Urban VIII does his thing at the Council of Clermont. He gives his fiery speech. He gets everybody hyped up. He's like, we're going to go retake the Holy Land. Arr! And everybody gets super excited and super bold, right? And then word begins to spread, right? Word begins to spread that a Holy Crusade is going to occur. Now, this is an era before the printing press. This is an era before postal services. This is an era when only the things that you could read and write were handwritten by monks and nuns, and 4% of the population was the only people that actually could read and write. And if you could read and write, 9 times out of 10, you were a priest. Now, interestingly enough, though, word will travel quickly through the grapevine, right? And this guy right here holds his own crusade, right? This dude is Peter the Hermit. Write that down. Peter the Hermit is on your test in the matching section, right? Peter the Hermit, at a monastery in France, outside of a cathedral of France, stands on the steps and says, I have received a letter from God saying we are supposed to fight and retake Jerusalem, right? And all these people were like, oh, no way, right? And this, coincidentally, went right in line with the First Crusade, right? So more than likely, Peter heard or was there when Urban VIII gave his proclamation of the First Crusade at the Council of Clermont, but Peter the Hermit, all the same, did a similar speech, just like Urban II did, on the steps of a church in France, and then got a massive group of poor people together, and word spread pretty quickly. So you actually had two crusades going on at the same time. The first crusade was in 1096, and 30,000 people showed up. But two types of people went out. One group was peasants and these terrible garbage knights, right? Old knights, retired knights, knights that didn't have enough money to afford full suits of armor, but really only had enough money to afford a sword, right? And the other half of them were actual crusading knights that I showed you in the picture. Fully armor-clad, Knights Templar type of figures that were actually there, ready to go off and fight a full military operation against the Muslim kingdoms in Jerusalem, right? So just so you understand, okay, those two types of people are going to go out, okay? Now, as the trained knights go, they have to take time to assemble, right? They have to take time to assemble together. And as you can see what I was talking about, the Islamic kingdoms are huge by this point. They have taken Jerusalem in 1099. They have actually done all of this amount of conquering and conquest during this time period. And here is the Byzantine Empire, or the Greek Orthodox Church right here. And this is the area where the Crusaders are coming from, right? So Peter the Great's force, not Peter the Great, Peter the Hermit's forces are coming from here. Pope Urban II's forces are coming from right here, right? So interestingly enough, they actually all set out at the same time. But the problem is that the crusading knights were at least intelligent and knew that Jerusalem is a long way away. Well, the poor crusaders and the People's Crusade under Peter the Hermit had no idea where they were going, how long it was going to take to get there, or what they were doing. So as the crusaders pushed through, the poor ones anyway, to go and establish these 4 states that they're going to actually end up doing. Did I take that out? So they actually want to push through and establish these states and take Jerusalem back. They actually massacred huge numbers of innocent Jewish people and Muslim people along the way, right? The poor people didn't know where they were going. So every time they would arrive at a city, they would be like, is this Jerusalem? And they'd be like, no, bro, this is Hungary. You're actually in Budapest right now. They'd be like, are you sure about that? You seem like you're lying to me. And they're like, well, no, you're just in the wrong spot. It's okay. They're like, you Christian? They're like, yes, we are. They're like, oh, I think you're a liar. And they would just like kill people for no apparent reason because it's a giant group of poor, uneducated people, right? And so during this part, the People's Crusade was a hilarious failure because as they got closer and closer to Constantinople and they were destroying cities along the way and actually murdering and killing people, that's not the hilarious part. Their group will actually fall all to pieces by the time it gets outside of Jerusalem, and a large portion of them are actually going to be killed by Muslim forces, all right? Now, but the trained knights, though, that's the interesting part. The First Crusade were strong enough to push into the Holy Land, take Jerusalem for the Christians, and establish 4 new stronghold states, right? Imagine them kind of like counties, right? Like parishes in Louisiana. The Christians came in and they took that land from the Islamic kingdoms and they established 4 new states, or strongholds, if you will. And they are known as Edessa, Antioch, Tripoli, and Jerusalem, right? So those 4 states. So the very first crusade did result in a win for the crusading Christians. Well, as relative as a win that it could be, right? The poor crusade, the People's Crusade, kind of failed fantastically, all right? So, but the actual trained knights that were sent out by Urban II, not Peter the Hermit, was actually pretty successful, okay? So everybody else is kind of lost, sort of, all right? So now we're getting into the Second Crusade, okay? So the Second Crusade is actually going to occur during the 1100s. So about 50 years later, okay? At about 50 years later, the Second Crusade is going to start off at about 1144. See that year right there? 1144. So about 50 years later, following 1095, okay? The Second Crusade is going to jump off, right? And that is actually going to be caused by the fact that the Muslims are going to take control of one of those states, okay? They're going to actually attack this one in the north. You have Edessa, Antioch, Tripoli, and Jerusalem, right? And what's going to occur is the Muslim forces and the Seljuk Turks are going to invade this way and go after Edessa, and they are actually going to take the city of Edessa, right? And then right here come the crusading knights in the blue arrows coming all the way in to actually help protect Jerusalem. And at the Battle of Damascus, they actually prevent the Muslims from retaking Jerusalem. But it's still considered a failure, right? The Second Crusade is considered a failure because the Muslims took control of Edessa, which was a stronghold, right? And actually the Christian forces are never able to take it back. So they went from having 4 states to now only having 3, right? So again, the Second Crusade was a pretty big failure, right? But then you got your Third Crusade, right? This massive undertaking of a crusade that will occur, right? And the Third Crusade is considered the second most important one, right? So when you're looking at the importance of the Crusades, your first one, your People's Crusade, is this Jerusalem, is considered the most well-documented and famous one. But then your second one's kind of like, we lost one of our states and never got it back. The third one is a pretty pivotal moment because it's when the Christians almost got Jerusalem back, right? Because what ends up happening is it ends up being two very intense figures that are going to square off against each other. So go ahead and jot this down underneath Third Crusade. The Third Crusade will be the forces of Saladin, who is actually the Sultan of Egypt and a very prideful Muslim, against the forces led by Richard the Lionheart, aka Richard I of England, right? So now Richard I is going to be a very intense Christian warrior. Make sure I'm giving you the Richard I of England. Make sure that we're talking about the right guy. Yep, Richard I is going to be a very intense Christian warrior, right? Now, Saladin is the Sultan of Egypt, okay? Very prideful Muslim, amazing general. I always put great dad because he had over 17 kids, right? So he's a very intense figure, and he learned how to be a great general from his uncle, right? His uncle was the Sultan of Egypt before him and actually defended Egypt from multiple Christian attacks, okay? So as the Christian Crusaders were coming through during the Second Crusade, multiple times they attacked Egypt to try and get to Jerusalem. Also, the Christians are going to attack Egypt because Egypt begins to grow, and Egypt is one of the second arms of the Muslim empires during this time. And Saladin refuses to take that, okay? And so he decides to go off, and he takes Jerusalem, and he takes control of it as well, right? So this is a major turning point throughout all of Western civilization's history. In the Third Crusade, the main idea here is the Christian forces lost control of Jerusalem to the Muslim forces during the Third Crusade, right? 3 Christian leaders are going to be called to go out there and take Jerusalem back, okay? And they're 2 guys. One's like Hector or Harold the First of Germany. One is somebody else. And then there's one right here. That is Richard the Lionheart is his nickname, but his name is actually Richard the First, okay? So many nobles answered the call to that crusade. Some of them absolutely hilarious. One of them was actually on his way, and he was a German noble, and he didn't take his armor off when he tried to ford over a river, and he ended up drowning. But the most famous out of all the nobles that goes is this guy, Richard I, also known as Richard the Lionheart. And what ends up occurring is Richard the Lionheart tries, with his forces, multiple times to actually take control of Jerusalem, right? But unfortunately, he and Saladin actually respect each other, tried to sue for peace, but Richard had to go back to England, never able to recapture Jerusalem, right? Saladin was able to push the Christian forces back every single time. And he did this using a lot of really creative tactics. One of the most creative tactics was the fact that he apparently positioned his forces right on the other side of a desert, right? And due to this, the Christian forces under Richard I would have to constantly try to push through this desert to get out there and try to actually fight Saladin's forces that were controlling Jerusalem. The issue being is that they didn't have the supplies to fight in the desert, so it led to a lot of different dehydration, starvation, and Richard I's forces were just never able to retake Jerusalem. So from that moment on, Jerusalem would fall to the Muslims, and the Christians would never actually retake it, right? So the Fourth Crusade is going to pop up, and then later ones as well, when Crusaders are going to do a lot of stupid stuff, right? They attack Constantinople, which leads to a lot of disorganization and lack of strong leadership, which causes the Fourth Crusade, which is going to be another massive failure. And even during the Fourth Crusade, the Christian forces, like idiots, burnt Constantinople almost to the ground, right? So Christian forces, actually, on accident, attacked Constantinople because they didn't know where they were going, and they burnt Constantinople to the ground, right? So now, massive failure in the Fourth Crusade. 5 more crusades, we believe, were going to happen following the Muslims, following the fourth one. But again, they were never able to retake it, right? But this is a really big, important part, showing you the High Middle Ages during the 1090s was the very first time that the Christians won a crusade and actually were prosperous. And then going into the 1200s, the Second Crusade, or not Second Crusade, the Second and the Third Crusade, going into the 1200s, moving into the late Middle Ages, that is when the Christian forces begin to decline, right? So basically, though, the Crusaders only ever won one crusade, and it was the first one, right? The first one was when they established the states of Antioch, Edessa, Tripoli, and Jerusalem, right? Now, unfortunately, do me a favor, do not write that down. Just write Children's Crusade, okay? Write Children's Crusade. We're going to talk about it in class, okay? We're going to talk about Children's Crusade and put a star next to it and leave 2 spaces underneath it. Just 2 lines and then just kind of skip over it. But we will talk about it. It's a very hilarious story that kind of like adds to the folklore of the Crusades and kind of shows you the romanticized idea that the Christian forces believe that they were in the right? And it's important because it'll actually help you answer one of your short answer questions on your test, right? So now, interestingly enough, though, the Crusades are very important when you're talking about them themselves, right? But the effects of them are probably the most important thing that you have to discuss when you're actually discussing these things in Western civilizations, right? Now, the effects of the Crusades include a lot of different stuff, right? You're talking about economic changes, okay? You're talking about political changes. You're talking about social changes as well. Your economic changes are going to come down to some very major things, including trade, right? As we know, in the Middle Ages, trade was basically non-existent, right? Trade was not very functional, not very good, very, very slow. Well, following the Crusades, trade and trade goods are going to increase after the Crusades, bringing more money and more economics back to Europe, right? Now, unfortunately, this came at the cost of war and death, which is disgusting that we're making this exchange, but the Crusades, however negative they were, did help economies return back to the Middle Ages Europe, which is a very big enduring theme of the Middle Ages, is when bad things happen, people make more money, all right? So now political changes are going to happen as well. Now, since so many lords and nobles went off to fight the Crusades, this bad boy, it's very important, went off to fight the Crusades, what's going to happen is a lot of lords are going to die during the Crusades. Now, since their land is up for grabs, the kings are going to end up taking that land, possessing it on their own, or giving it to nobles they trust more, and this is going to grow the power of kings. So following the Crusades, you're also seeing the strength of monarchs is growing as well. Put that down in the political changes. The strengths of monarchs are growing, right? And the big social changes that are going to occur is Christianity is now, because of the Crusades, going to be isolated to Western Europe, right? Well, mainly Roman Catholicism is going to be isolated to Western Europe, and then Eastern Orthodox is going to be isolated to Eastern Europe, and it's going to be isolated away from other faiths, leading to ignorance, racism, and negative views of the other side. Muslims are going to begin to, again, not trust Christian forces. It's going to lead to a lot of economic hardships. And another big social change right here, put this up. Muslims prevented the movement of Christians through their land, okay? That is huge, okay? Christians are going to isolate themselves away, yes, but Muslims are also going to prevent Christians from traveling through their land because of these wars. So a huge amount of distrust between the faiths is going to occur. Now, some of you are like, well, Mr. Terry, what about the Jewish people? Well, the Jewish people are going to have yet another diaspora, and they're going to get spread out further through Europe, and just their entire communities are going to continue to be broken up. Now, there are going to be some really odd things about the Crusades as well that you need to jot down that are very, very important, okay? And the odd things about the Crusades include the fact that, one, you need to understand that before the First Crusade, that the church power had kind of reached its height, okay? Now, in the 1080s, Pope Gregory VII and Pope Gregory VII and Henry, wow, I did not write that down right, okay? So, anyway, sorry about that. Just ignore this, okay? Ignore this. That is not supposed to be, that's supposed to be done like Pope Gregory VII versus Henry IV. But just so you understand, church power had kind of reached its height, right? And you could actually see this in papal suprematic things when popes were claiming power over kings, and this is a good example of one when Gregory VII and Henry IV of the Holy Roman Empire are yelling back and forth at each other, and Henry IV is like, I want to appoint my own bishops, and Pope Gregory says no, and then he excommunicates Henry and his entire country in an interdiction, and then he makes him wear a hair shirt. It's crazy. And also, on top of that, nobles were constantly fighting each other for land and power. And they were also going to war with their own kings, holding rebellions. So a lot of people, some historians believe that Urban II just wanted to unite Europe against a common enemy, right? So there is a chance that that was a big reason why. Another big thing that so many say is that Pope Urban never actually claimed the Crusades to be a holy war at all, that he sent the Christians out on a pilgrimage, hoping the Islamic kingdoms would attack them, causing a war, which these things would actually bring money into the papacy. So it could have been a money grab by Pope Urban as well. And then also so you understand that most of the Crusaders were nobles who were leading bands of poor people. Very few of them were these trained crusading knights that you think of. So basically, in a nutshell, Brother Martin's mascot is not supposed to be a trained knight. It's supposed to be a poor person with like a sharp stick. All right, so because like not very many of the Crusaders themselves were actually trained knights at all, right? So that's some of the stuff about the Crusades right there, but now we need to jump over and switch gears a little bit, right? So go ahead and jump down a space after you have the Crusade stuff, and some of you are like, Mr. Terry, this is so long. Well, calm down. The next thing we have to talk about isn't that intense, and actually not that long. So after the Crusades, big guy we were just talking about, King Richard I during the Third Crusade, right? So during the Third Crusade, King Richard I in about 1199, decides he wants to return back to England. He was like, okay, I have been defeated by the Muslim forces under Saladin, and I have to now return to England embarrassed, right? He's got to go there, and he's got to go back, and he's like, oh, but at least my people love me. They've nicknamed me the Lionheart, right? Fun fact, that actually King Richard was pretty terrible. He was actually a pretty garbage king, and a lot of this is due to the fact that, ironically enough, he only spent like 6 months, give or take, actually in England at all, right? He actually didn't spend much time there while he was king, mainly because he loved to go off and fight wars, right? He loved to fight wars. He wanted to go fight the Crusades, so he actually didn't spend really any time there at all, and most of his people actually disliked him, right? So King Richard was a pretty terrible king, so much so to the point that when he was coming back from the Crusades, when he left, he was kidnapped by his cousin. I think it's Otto the First. His cousin kidnaps him on the way and sends word to his brother, King John, who is ruling over England in his absence, and says, hey, give us a ransom and we'll give you your brother back. And then King John says, well, none of us really like him, so you should just keep him. It's fine. All right, so it's a very interesting little dichotomy, and this is a fun way to remember King Richard the Lionheart. He was actually kidnapped on his way back from the Third Crusade. But what ends up happening is on his way back after he's released from this ransom, he does die, right? In 1199, he dies. And King John is going to take over, and that's his youngest brother, right? King John is such garbage of a king. Like, we know that King Richard was a bad king. His brother John was even worse, right? And that was his youngest brother, and he was so bad that he doesn't even get a number. Like, he's not John the First, he's just King John. And everybody's like, wow, King John, you did the namesake of John so poorly that nobody even wants to give you a number, right? And what's going to end up occurring with King John is after King Richard the Lionheart dies and King John becomes king, right, ascends the throne, he loses all of his lands in France that William of Normandy had originally given them, right? So when William of Normandy came over and took over England, that means that English holdings are going to be mixed with French ones, right? So there are going to be these lands in northern France owned by the King of England, right? Because they're going to be basically like the Duke of Normandy all the time. Well, because King John's such a terrible king, he went to war with France and lost. And so he lost all of those lands to the French king, right? What a pansy. Now, what's going to end up occurring, though, is because of this, King John decides he wants to try and make all of that money back as fast as possible. Because when you lose wars, what happens? You lose money, right? You lose a ton of money. You end up going into debt and you had to pay these things back, right? So since he lost all those lands to France in a very expensive war, he began to rapidly raise taxes, right? King John's like, oh, I'll just raise taxes on all the nobles. I'll just hike their taxes up. They'll pay me. It'll be fine, right? But then the nobles are like, no, you're the bad king. You're the reason why this happened. You should figure out ways to pay for it. Do not tax us for your loss, right? And the nobles were so angry that they drew up a document, drew up an army, stormed into London, and said, sign this piece of paper right now. This is huge. I need you to circle this. I need you to highlight this because this thing is ridiculously important. This document will follow us through Western civilizations for the rest of the course, okay? And that document is so important that every single time I say it, I expect you to excitedly say yay. You know what? So let's practice it really quick. The document's name itself is known as the Magna Carta. Very good job. Now look really closely. When I say this in class, I'm going to be offering you 3 points of extra credit on your test, okay? That's a full question back for free. When I say the Magna Carta, when we are reviewing during your warm-up, if not everyone says yay, you don't get it, okay? So when I say Magna Carta, you must say what? Yay! Good job. Make sure you write that in your notes, okay? It's very important. For the rest of this year, when I say the phrase or the word of that document, the Magna Carta, you must exclaim your excitedness because of how great of a document this thing is, okay? And what this document did is it changed the game of everything in Europe, right? Absolutely everything. What it ends up doing is it limits the power of the king, and in Latin it is known as the Great Charter. This lays the groundwork for democracy in Europe, and it even establishes the British Parliament. I want you to go ahead and jot this stuff down. We will talk about this further in class. I will see you guys soon. Y'all have a great rest of your weekend. You're doing so great. See y'all soon.